if we can pivot a little bit, we've talked about Reagan. What are some interesting stories about how Milton Friedman navigated the Reagan and maybe even the Nixon administrations and how he was able to gain influence?
Well, the Nixon administration is an interesting case because I've been talking about inflation and the different consequences it had. One consequence it had is that it began to undermine the Bretton Woods currency system that was established in the wake of World War II. Now, Bretton Woods, what it did basically, it ended up inadvertently putting the US dollar at the center of the world economic system. But under Bretton Woods, countries of the industrialized West agreed to trade their currency in set ratios that government set. So a franc was worth so many dollars, or a German mark was worth so many francs. And then also under this system, countries could come to the United States and they could trade the dollars that they held for gold, because the U.S. was on a sort of modified gold standard. There was a ratio of gold to paper money. And so the system was set up, and very quickly, most countries the dollar was at the heart of it, and that the converting into and out of dollars was really the mechanism of trade for many of these countries. So Friedman said, what we should have is floating exchange rates. This is an idea, again, of instead of having a top-down design of policy, an administered policy, we will have policy set by prices. And you should be able to trade currencies on an open market. They should trade and they should fluctuate, and that would be fine. Totally outlandish idea. But he was pinpointing the fact that Bretton Woods had an instability, and that instability began to emerge in the time of inflation. So you have more and more dollars being printed. They're worth less and less. If European nations keep trading their currency for dollars, they're going to be importing inflation into their own economies. So they say, we don't want these dollars. We'd like some gold instead. And they have the right to go to the Treasury, send in an order, and get gold out. And so they start doing this more and more, and it's called the gold drain. And the United States starts running out of gold. They're aware this is happening through the 60s. They're trying various things to fix it. And when Nixon comes into office in 1968, Friedman sends him a memo, and it says, this is going to be a real problem. He says something like, this is a running sore, and you have to lance it right away. Some very
Nice.
graphic
Very nice.
metaphor. Otherwise, it's gonna explode. And Nixon just files the memo away. Nixon loved people to think he was influenced by and following the wisdom of Milton Friedman, but he didn't actually want to do that. He just wanted a political benefit that came from it. So then comes the moment where the U.S. Treasury Department realizes we're going to run out of gold. What should we do? And everybody decamps to Camp David, and Nixon decides we're just going to stop redeeming currency for gold. It's called slamming the gold window shut. Done. And he also, at that same meeting, decides to institute price controls. He does a whole bunch of stuff. It's an emergency. He calls it the New Economic Plan, which is an unconscious echo of the Soviet New Economic Plan. So a problematic name, a problematic policy. And Friedman is livid at the price controls, but he's like, actually, it's great that you closed the gold window. Let's go all the way to floating exchange rates. And this idea was heresy within the Treasury Department. Everyone's very committed to the idea of the gold standard, convertibility, possibility, the United States at the core of the financial system, kind of hem and haw. But at this point, Friedman has a very close relationship with George Shultz. And George Shultz is a high-level appointee who will eventually, over the course of the Nixon administrations, become the Treasury Secretary. And so Friedman is feeding Shultz all his ideas about how we should move to floating exchange rates, how we shouldn't try to reconstruct Bretton Woods. And the people in Treasury, it's funny because I've read some of their accounts, and actually Paul Volcker is in the Treasury Department at this time, and he can kind of sense that Friedman is in here somewhere, like feeding his boss ideas.
Yeah.
He doesn't quite know. And, then in the oral history, Schultz talks about this quite a bit. So at any rate, Friedman exerts this behind-the-scenes influence, and what Schultz does is just kind of lets Bretton Woods fade away. He doesn't make grand pronouncements. It just slowly, the world shifts to a regime of for a while it was like a regime of steady prices, and then they call it a steady regime of changing prices or whatever. The language changes, the reality changes, and they kind of end up where they are. So that's a real measure of Friedman's influence. If there had been another economist in Schultz's ear that said, no, catastrophe is imminent, we have to go back to Bretton Woods, he probably would have worked harder. The US government would have worked harder. And so that becomes one of these pieces of globalization. And, what people don't realize is there used to be, in addition to these floating set capital ratios, you couldn't bring capital in and out of different countries. You had to register, you couldn't invest. There were all these rules and strictures, and the falling of Bretton Woods really blows that all open. It's a precursor to globalization. So Friedman is right there. Now, he's very ambivalent about Nixon. I mean, he sees that Nixon is not an honest person. He thinks he's very intelligent. And Nixon's dream is to create a new centrist majority. So he does many things to go back on his supposed economic principles and ideals. So Friedman does not like this. He doesn't like the price controls. He's in communication with his old mentor, Arthur Burns, who's now the chair of the Federal Reserve. And Burns is basically doing everything wrong in monetary policy. And I describe this in the book in some detail, these anguished letters back and forth. And basically, as I see it, Burns doesn't have a solid theory of inflation. And the more Friedman pushes him, it's almost like Burns is willfully ignoring Friedman and kind of doing the opposite of what Friedman says. So Burns is running a very loose monetary policy. Inflation is quite considerable over the 70s. I mean, we were all spooked by what did it get to 6%, something like that recently for a very short time. This is inflation going over 10%, hovering in 8% for basically the whole decade of the 70s, going up and down with extremely elevated rates. And so the Carter presidency largely falls. Foreign policy is a big part of it, but the failure to tame inflation is part of it. And then Reagan comes in. And now Reagan loves Friedman and Friedman loves Reagan. Very mutual feeling. The Reagan administration creates like an advisory economic board. Friedman's on it. He's retired now. He's entering his kind of golden years. But he really has Reagan's ear. And here what he does is he convinces Reagan of his theory of inflation, which is inflation has been caused. It's a monetary phenomenon that has been caused by bad monetary policy. Inflation has an accelerating dynamic. The only way to end inflation is by really showing and signaling that government policy has changed. And when you do that, it's very painful for a short amount of time. People will suffer, but then you will come out on the other side into stable prices. And this is what you need for economic prosperity. So the man who implements this policy, Paul Volcker, he's definitely influenced by Friedman. Buys the big picture of Friedman. He even buys Friedman's specific technique of the monetary growth rule and of the focus on monetary aggregates, which Friedman has said, right? Money matters. Aggregates matter. That's what money is. Pretty quickly, Volcker finds that because of inflation and the financial deregulation in response to it, the aggregates don't work the way Friedman said they would. And so the specific policy Friedman recommends, Volcker tries it for a year or so, doesn't work super well. But what does work is letting interest rates go high, go above inflation to a point where both the general citizenry and the financial markets believe like, oh, they're actually serious about inflation. And because we've had a decade of inflation with all these presidents saying, forward, we're going to whip inflation now, that monetary policy has lost credibility. This is why people focus so much on credibility today, because once it's lost, it's really hard to get it back. And one way Volcker gets it back is interest rates over 20%, unemployment very high as 25% in like construction sectors. And as this is happening, Milton Friedman is whispering in Reagan's ear, this is the right thing. Stay the course. This is going to work. Now, interestingly, he hates Volcker. Volcker hates him. And Friedman will never give Volcker credit for this policy, but he will give Reagan credit for this policy. But he owes credit himself for keeping Reagan from wobbling on this policy and just pushing it through. And he also tells Reagan very pragmatically, you better do this now You've got a 4-year term. Do this in the first 2 years of your term. Things will have turned around by 1984 when you run for re-election, and you'll benefit from it. And that's absolutely what happens.